Rick Ross just did something nobody in hip-hop has done in 20 years. And if you blinked during the last 2 weeks, Rick Ross already flipped the entire chessboard on Drake before Set in Stone even leaves the pressing plant. This is not a rumor. This is not a fan theory pulled from a TikTok comment section at 3 in the morning. Pull up the receipts, because we pulled them for you. Rick Ross walked onto the Link Up Tonight couch, looked Amir Moradi dead in the eye, and told the entire hip-hop world that there is not a back and forth. There is not a beef. There is not a war of words. There is only one train on one track, and the train is not stopping for Drake, not stopping for a diss, not stopping for a peace treaty, not stopping for anybody. And the second Rick Ross said it, the internet detonated. Listen to me carefully, because everybody else covering the story missed the buried detail, and this is the angle nobody on YouTube is telling you. Rick Ross did not stumble into this moment. Rick Ross engineered it. Rick Ross has been quietly setting the trap for 18 months, and Drake walked into it wearing an Iceman chain that Rick Ross already promised to freeze on national television. Rick Ross said talk to every jeweler in Miami that sells fake diamonds, because Rick Ross has never met a person who ice rose. Rick Ross said it with a smile. Rick Ross said it with a smirk. And Rick Ross said it 3 days before Drake's Iceman rollout stalled on the Billboard charts. Coincidence? Rick Ross does not do coincidence. Rick Ross does chess moves. Here is what the other channels are not telling you. Rick Ross is dropping the 12th studio album on the 17th, and every single one of the previous 11 Rick Ross solo albums debuted top 10 on the Billboard 200. 11 for 11. That is not luck. That is not marketing. That is Rick Ross running a hit streak that stretches back 2 full decades. Miami Gardens Elementary might have taught Rick Ross that 11 does not fit inside 10, but Rick Ross taught the industry that Rick Ross does not lose album weeks. And now Rick Ross is walking into release week with a diss track loaded, a Drake feud simmering, an Iceman roast on tape, and a Coliseum-themed album title that Rick Ross literally pulled from the ruins of ancient Rome. Set it in stone. Etched. Permanent. Unmovable. The kind of thing you cannot delete off streaming. When the tide turns. Now watch this. Because the next part is the part that made me pause the interview and rewind it 3 times. Rick Ross did not just take a shot at Drake. Rick Ross took a shot at the business model. Rick Ross said Rick Ross gets paid before the album drops. Rick Ross said Rick Ross has 25 ventures and partnerships. Rick Ross said Rick Ross just came back from Dubai, and Rick Ross is fly to Canada on Friday. Rick Ross said one strip club performance in Vegas covered every expense Rick Ross has for the entire year. And then Rick Ross said the quiet part out loud. Rick Ross said whoever hands you money before the album drops is only doing it once if the album flops. Rick Ross said that with a straight face on a podcast, and the internet immediately connected the dots to Larry Jackson and Gamma and Drake's rumored 9-figure Iceman advance. Rick Ross did not say Drake's name. Rick Ross did not have to. Rick Ross let the algorithm say it for Rick Ross. Rewind the tape and pay attention to the pattern. Rick Ross has been doing this for a year and a half. When Drake dropped push-ups and named Rick Ross in the second verse, Rick Ross fired back inside 48 hours with champagne moments, and the last minute of that record was Rick Ross ripping Drake apart line after line without ever slowing down to breathe. When Drake dropped Make Them Pay Off the Iceman project and referenced Rick Ross again, Rick Ross did not respond with a song. Rick Ross responded with something worse. Rick Ross pulled up every negative comment posted under the Iceman rollout, sat down in front of camera, and read them out loud, laughing between reactions, and the clip trended for 72 hours straight. Every reaction channel ran with it. Every hip-hop page reposted it. Every Drake fan account tried to bury it. And Rick Ross just kept smiling. Then Rick Ross walked onto Patrick Bet-David's podcast and called Iceman disappointing. Rick Ross mocked Drake's singing. Rick Ross said Drake sounded like Drake was crying on the record. Rick Ross said the whole project was emotional. Rick Ross said the engineers who mixed it needed trauma therapy. Rick Ross said the interns lost a year of their lives working on that album. And Rick Ross delivered all with the calm of a boss who already collected the check, already booked the flight, already iced the chain, already sold 11 top 10 albums, and already knows exactly what is about to happen on the 17th. Here is the angle nobody is pulling on. Everybody keeps calling this a rap beef. Nobody is calling it what it actually is. This is a hostile takeover. Rick Ross is not trying to embarrass Drake. Rick Ross is trying to relocate the crown. Rick Ross said Rick Ross was the #1 in the rap game, and Rick Ross showed love to everybody who came up. Rick Ross said no real one wants to see another one lose. Rick Ross said Drake, if you're listening to this, do not lose, homie. But Rick Ross said it in the exact tone a boxer uses when the boxer is about to knock somebody unconscious. Rick Ross said it while wearing green emeralds on the AP. Rick Ross said it while sitting on a private jet that is currently being updated with Starlink. Rick Ross said it while flying commercial to Colombia to party with Trick Daddy because Rick Ross felt like it. Rick Ross said it while the internet accused Rick Ross of going broke, and Rick Ross laughed and posted 6 figures worth of yacht upgrades the same afternoon. You are not putting Drake at Rick Ross's level. Rick Ross said it out loud on a podcast. Rick Ross said Drake would have cleared everything up if Drake actually had the receipts. Rick Ross said Drake would have addressed it and moved on. Rick Ross said Drake did not, because Drake could not. And Rick Ross said all of it while confirming there are diss tracks on Set in Stone. Rick Ross did not name a target. Rick Ross did not have to. Rick Ross said one train on the track. Rick Ross said the train does not stop for nothing. And every person who has watched the Rick Ross versus Drake war since 2024 knows exactly who is tied to that track. Now, let me pull back the curtain on the part everybody is missing. Rick Ross and Drake were not always at war. Rick Ross and Drake were partners. Rick Ross and Drake made Stay Schemin'. Rick Ross and Drake made records that shaped an era. Drake said on camera that Rick Ross was Drake's favorite rapper to feature on any song. DJ Khaled confirmed that Drake and Rick Ross' joint album was under serious consideration. Fat Joe cannot understand why Rick Ross keeps swinging. But here's the buried timeline. When Meek Mill went to war with Drake in 2015, Rick Ross stayed neutral. Rick Ross let Meek and Drake work it out. Rick Ross did not pick a side. Rick Ross kept the working relationship alive. Rick Ross kept the checks coming. Rick Ross kept the features flowing. For almost a full decade after that, Rick Ross and Drake acted like nothing ever happened. So what changed? This is the part nobody is investigating. This is a missing puzzle piece. In 2024, Future and Metro Boomin went to war with Drake over We Don't Trust You, and Rick Ross made a choice. Rick Ross backed Future. Rick Ross backed Metro. Rick Ross posted the support publicly, and Drake noticed. Drake dropped push-ups. Drake named Rick Ross in the verse. And that was the moment the entire 10-year truce burned to the ground. Rick Ross did not walk away. Rick Ross could not walk away because Rick Ross is Miami. And Miami does not eat from the same plate as somebody who sends a shot in a diss record. That is the code. That is the reason. That is the buried why nobody on the reaction circuit is willing to say out loud. And now Rick Ross is dropping Set in Stone on the 17th. And Rick Ross is doing it right in the middle of an Iceman rollout that critics are already calling disappointing. Rick Ross is dropping Set in Stone right as Drake fans are debating whether Drake has 3 flop albums in a row. Rick Ross is dropping Set in Stone right as the industry is quietly asking whether Drake is washed. Rick Ross is dropping Set It in Stone right as Kendrick Lamar's Not Like Us verdict has already been rendered. Rick Ross is dropping Set It in Stone right as every real Miami hustler is watching to see if Rick Ross can pull the rare feat of turning 12 albums into 12 top 10 debuts. And Rick Ross is doing it while claiming Rick Ross is worth $150 million, and while telling the world Rick Ross mows a 400-acre lawn with a John Deere that has air conditioning and tinted windows because Rick Ross is the boss. Read that again. Rick Ross mows Rick Ross's own lawn. Rick Ross has a fleet of tractors. Rick Ross drives the biggest one so everybody knows who the boss is. Rick Ross calls a friendship every time Rick Ross fires the mower up. Rick Ross cuts 400 acres of grass with an air-conditioned cab. Rick Ross tinted the windows on the tractor. Rick Ross put a radio in it. And Rick Ross said Rick Ross does it because Rick Ross wants to save the lawn money. This is the man Drake decided to poke. Now here's where the story turns sideways and nobody is asking the right question. Why is Rick Ross's promotion cycle so quiet? Some analysts are calling Set It in Stone underpromoted. Some analysts are calling the rollout messy. Some analysts are saying there is no Drake feature this time, and no proper single, and no billboard campaign, and no visualizer strategy. Some analysts are calling it a jump ahead of a flop. But let me tell you what those analysts are missing. Rick Ross does not need promotion. Rick Ross is a promotion. Every interview Rick Ross does becomes the ad campaign. Every jab at Drake becomes a trailer. Every viral clip of Rick Ross laughing at Iceman becomes a free commercial. Every reaction channel that runs a story becomes an unpaid affiliate. Rick Ross has flipped the entire promotion model inside out. Rick Ross is running a stealth rollout powered by controversy, And the controversy is Drake. Rick Ross said Rick Ross has 11 top 10 albums. Rick Ross said Rick Ross has never sat on a podcast doing little deals. Rick Ross said Rick Ross has sold records for the last 20 years. Rick Ross said Rick Ross was already paid before the album ever came out. Rick Ross said that with a Maybach in the driveway, an Aston Martin in the garage, a green emerald AP on the wrist, and a jet on the tarmac getting Starlink installed. And then Rick Ross said the thing that snapped every headline in half. Rick Ross said Rick Ross does not know what these little podcasts are talking about. Rick Ross said Rick Ross does not know what these little deals are. Rick Ross said Rick Ross has been eating. Rick Ross said Rick Ross is still eating. Rick Ross said Rick Ross will eat on the 17th. Meanwhile, listen to what is happening on the other side of the war. Drake pushed the Iceman album back. Drake shifted the single strategy. Drake watched the numbers dip. Drake watched Kendrick's Not Like Us dominate cultural conversation for the entire year. Drake watched Future distance himself. Drake watched Metro do the same. Drake watched Rick Ross release Champagne Moments and go viral. Drake watched every reaction video pick the same side. And then Drake dropped Make Them Pay and referenced Rick Ross again. And Rick Ross pulled out the comments, laughed on camera, and made the response go viral inside a day. Rick Ross is 1 for 1. Rick Ross is 2 for 2. Rick Ross is 3 for 3. Rick Ross is playing perfect chess, and the internet is playing checkers. Do not miss this part. Rick Ross also said something on Fat Joe's podcast that everybody skipped over. Fat Joe asked Rick Ross why the feud is still alive after all this time. Fat Joe asked why Rick Ross keeps swinging. Fat Joe asked why Rick Ross does not just let it go. And Rick Ross answered by not answering. Rick Ross laughed. Rick Ross smiled. Rick Ross changed the subject. Because Rick Ross knows something Fat Joe does not know. Rick Ross knows the album is loaded. Rick Ross knows the tracks are already mastered. Rick Ross knows the features are already locked. Rick Ross knows the 17th is coming. And Rick Ross is not going to spoil the ending on somebody else's podcast when Rick Ross can spoil in the song. So now let me connect the last dot for you. When Amir Moradi asked Rick Ross about Iceman, Rick Ross said never heard of it. 3 words. Never heard of it. Rick Ross said it flat. Rick Ross said it calm. Rick Ross said it while looking straight into the camera. And every person watching that clip understood exactly what Rick Ross meant. Rick Ross did not just dismiss the album. Rick Ross erased it from the record. Rick Ross deleted it in real time. Rick Ross treated Iceman like it did not exist. And the second the clip hit Twitter, Drake fans lost their minds and Rick Ross fans lit the internet on fire, and every hip-hop page ran the story like it was breaking news. Rick Ross knows exactly what Rick Ross is doing. Rick Ross has been in this game for 2 decades. Rick Ross survived Freeway Ricky Ross. Rick Ross survived the correctional officer photos. Rick Ross survived the health scares. Rick Ross survived Meek versus Drake. Rick Ross survived Future versus Metro versus Drake. Rick Ross survived every wave that would have drowned a lesser artist. And Rick Ross came out of every one of those storms with a top 10 album, a bigger business, a bigger platform, a bigger bag. Rick Ross is not a rapper anymore. Rick Ross is a corporation. Rick Ross is Wingstop. Rick Ross is Belair. Rick Ross is Luke Belair. Rick Ross is Maybach Music. Rick Ross is a 2-time New York Times bestselling author. Rick Ross is a $150 million operation. And Rick Ross is about to add a 12th top 10 album to the resume on the 17th. So the real question is not whether Set It in Stone will have a diss track. Rick Ross already confirmed it. The real question is not whether the diss track is about Drake. Rick Ross already implied it. The real question is not whether the album will chart. Rick Ross already has 11 for 11. The real question is the one nobody is asking. The real question is what happens after the 17th. Because when Rick Ross drops Set It in Stone, Rick Ross is going to trigger a chain reaction that pulls in every artist tied to this rivalry. Kendrick will be watching. Future will be watching. Metro will be watching. Meek will be watching. J. Cole will be watching from the sidelines. And Drake will be watching from wherever Drake is watching from these days. Because Drake has been quiet. And quiet is the loudest sound in hip-hop right now. Rick Ross is running a play the industry has not seen since 50 Cent buried Ja Rule. Rick Ross is running a play Nas ran when Nas dropped Ether. Rick Ross is running a play Kendrick ran when Kendrick dropped Not Like Us. But Rick Ross is running it with 20 years of catalog behind Rick Ross. with a business empire funding the movement, with an entire city called Miami backing every syllable. And Rick Ross is doing it while telling the world Rick Ross is worth $150 million, while cutting Rick Ross's own grass on a tinted John Deere, while flying commercial one week and private the next, while wearing a green emerald AP that critics call fake and Rick Ross called fun. You want to know the moment everything shifted? Watch the Link Up Tonight interview again. When Amir asked about the relationship with Drake, Rick Ross said the love was genuine. Rick Ross said the love had been genuine since Drake came into the game. Rick Ross said Rick Ross moved for Drake the same way Rick Ross moved for Weezy. Rick Ross said all of that. And then Rick Ross said there is no back and forth. There is one train on the track. And Rick Ross said the train does not stop. That sentence is the entire story. That sentence is a thesis. That sentence is a trailer. That sentence is the album cover in one line. One train, one track, one direction, no breaks. Now let me leave you with a buried detail that nobody else caught. Rick Ross said Set It in Stone came together in 2.5 months. 2.5 months. That is a lightning-fast turnaround for a 12 studio album. Rick Ross said it like it was nothing. Rick Ross said it like Rick Ross Records in Rick Ross's sleep. But think about the timing. 2.5 months back from the 17th puts the album's construction directly on top of the Iceman rollout window. Rick Ross was recording Set It in Stone at the exact moment Drake was rolling out Iceman. Rick Ross was writing lines while Drake was dropping visualizers. Rick Ross was mixing tracks while Drake was pushing back release dates. Rick Ross was building an entire album in response mode, and Drake did not even know Rick Ross was in studio. That is not a beef. That is an ambush. That is a strategy. That is the play. That is the reason the 17th matters. That is the reason Set It in Stone is titled Set It in Stone. Because when Rick Ross carves something into stone, Rick Ross does not intend for anybody to erase it. Rick Ross intends for the Coliseum to still be standing 1,000 years later. Rick Ross intends for the etchings to outlive the empire. Rick Ross intends for the record to run past the response. So the only thing left to do is watch. Watch the 17th. Watch the charts. Watch the reaction. Watch which songs get pulled apart. Watch which lines get slowed down. Watch which bars get looped on TikTok. Watch which reaction channels break the story first. Watch the numbers. Watch the debut. Watch the Billboard 200. Watch the streaming totals. Watch whether Rick Ross makes it 12 for 12. Watch whether Drake responds. Watch whether Drake stays silent. Watch whether the Iceman gets melted or the boss gets buried. Watch every second. Because Rick Ross has been telling us for 18 months that the train is coming, and the 17th is when the train finally pulls into the station. Drop a comment below and tell me what you think. Is Rick Ross about to hand Drake the biggest loss of the decade? Or is Set It in Stone about to be the flop of the century? Do you believe Rick Ross has a diss track loaded for Drake? Or do you think Rick Ross is faking a whole thing to sell records? Do you think 11 top 10 albums becomes 12? Or do you think the streak finally snaps? Hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel. Share this video with the one friend who still thinks Drake is untouchable, and stick around, because on the 17th we're going live the second the album drops, and we're going to break down every single bar Rick Ross fires at Drake, line by line, second by second, until the smoke clears. One train, one track, 17th. See you there, because when the smoke clears and the numbers land and the Billboard chart refreshes on Sunday, only one of these men walks out with the crown still bolted to head, and everything Rick Ross said, everything Rick Ross hinted, everything Rick Ross laughed at, everything Rick Ross iced, everything Rick Ross etched into that Coliseum album cover is pointing to one outcome nobody wants to say out loud yet. Watch the 17th. Do not blink. The Rick Ross train has finally landed.